Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia Professor Lars Calmfors, tēnā koe, tuku ingoa, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Well, welcome. Focus of our 3 stewardship reports that the Treasury will be publishing over the following year. In April, we will release the draft of our long-term insights briefing on sustainable and resilient policy over the cycle. And the learnings from this seminar will also inform our long-term fiscal statement and investment statement, which will both be published later this year. The assessment focuses on a range of potential impacts on the sustainability of our long-term fiscal position and how to manage the range of risks. Let me now introduce our speaker, Professor Lars Calmfors, who we are thrilled to have with us today. So what struck me about reading through Lars' biography is the critical role that he has played in Sweden in managing the interface between policy making and the academic community. We really appreciate your flexibility around the time difference, Lars. So Professor Lars Calmfors is the Professor Emeritus at the Institute for International Economics at Stockholm University and Senior Research Fellow at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm. His main research concerns are labour economics and macroeconomic policy. Lars has been a member of the Committee for Sweden's Central Bank Prize in Economic Sciences in the memory of Alfred Nobel. And he has chaired the Economic Council in the Swedish Ministry for Finance, the Government Commission on European Monetary Union, the European Economic Advisory Council at CES-IFO, the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council, and the Labour Policy Council. He is currently a member of the Economic Council of the Minister for Finance and of the Labour Market Policy Council of the Minister for Employment. He has done expert work for treasuries in the UK, Finland, Norway, and the OECD. That's how Sweden's fiscal policy framework and policy measures have reduced debt while addressing new economic stabilisation challenges. Sweden's parliament is currently in the process of revising its fiscal framework, and Lars and his colleagues have written extensively about the role of fiscal and monetary policy in stabilisation, as well as how to manage longer-term sustainability of fiscal policy. And we've also asked for him to speak briefly about his insights with respect to fiscal policy councils. The topic's relevant to New Zealand as we grapple with when, how, and how fiscal policy can be used to buffer society from shocks and cycles, and to do so in a sustainable way. Just a word on logistics. I will now invite Lars to deliver his presentation, which will be followed by a short discussion. For the discussion, if you use the Q&A function in Teams, post your questions there. And if you have any technical queries, please use the standard chat function, and I will moderate the questions. So thank you very much, Lars, and over to you, and welcome again.
So, good morning to you, although it's late evening for me. Thanks for the opportunity to give this speech. It's an honor, since New Zealand has in many respects been a forerunner when it comes to fiscal transparency and monetary policy. Even though we are at opposite ends of the world, many economic policy problems are, of course, similar. So there should be some scope for learning from each other. So now I have problems with moving my pictures. Oh, there, it works. So I shall structure my speech in the following way. First, a snapshot view of fiscal developments in Sweden. Then I shall try to describe the national fiscal framework. I shall comment on the relationship between the national Swedish rules and the European Union rules. I'll try to summarize some of the current discussion on the fiscal framework in Sweden, then turn to the stabilisation policy role of fiscal policy and the relationship to monetary policy. And finally, I'll say something about the role of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council. But first then, a snapshot view of how public finances have developed. General government consolidated gross debt, that's what we in Europe call the Maastricht debt. That's overall public sector debt after we have netted out internal claims and debts within the sector. As you can see, that has fallen over time. It's now as low as 33% of GDP. In the mid-1990s, before the start of the diagram, the government debt ratio was well above 70% of GDP. So we have had a very different development from that in most other EU countries, and in Britain and the US, where government debt ratios have instead been rising over time. There's a similar picture of improvements in public finances if we also take government financial assets into account and look at the government net financial wealth. Between 2000 and today, we have gone from negative net financial wealth, around 30% of GDP, to positive net financial wealth of the same magnitude. An important factor behind this has been fiscal surpluses, or at least only small fiscal deficits. So the green curve here is actual government net lending. The red curve is structural net lending. So together with nominal GDP growth, the surpluses or small deficits, they have helped bring down the debt ratio. Net financial wealth has increased mainly because of appreciation of government-owned stock. At the same time, overall fiscal policy has been mostly countercyclical. You can see this from the diagram. The vertical axis shows the difference between overall government net lending, including the automatic stabilizers, and the fiscal net lending target as a measure of the fiscal stance. And then on the horizontal axis is the GDP gap. And you can see a very clear positive correlation, countercyclical policies, which also is very different to most other EU countries where fiscal policy has instead been pro-cyclical. So overall, fiscal developments in Sweden have been much stronger than in most other advanced economies, which we like to associate with a quite stringent national fiscal framework. So now I'm turning to that. We went through a very deep economic crisis in the first half of the 1990s, high unemployment, large fiscal deficits, rapidly increasing government debt. This led politicians in the second half of the 1990s to adopt a number of reforms to rein in fiscal policy. First, the budget process in the parliament was reformed. Earlier, the fiscal balance was more or less the outcome of a number of individual tax and expenditure decisions. Now it's a top-down process. In a first stage, decisions are taken on taxes and overall expenditure levels in some 17 different areas. And then in a second stage, decisions are taken on individual expenditure items. But then an increase in one item in an expenditure area has to be matched by an equally large cut in some other item in the same area. There is a surplus target that was introduced also in the late 1990s for general government net lending. It was first set at 1% of GDP. From 2019, it's been 0.33% of GDP. It's a target that does not apply to every year. It applies over the business cycle. And of course, the room is to give room for the automatic stabilizers to work, and also to allow, if necessary, discretionary fiscal policy decisions to stabilize the economy in the case of large cyclical swings. We have expenditure ceilings for the central government, ceilings that are decided 3 years in advance. Of course, then in order to prevent expenditure increases to jeopardize the surplus target. These ceilings earlier played quite an important role as binding constraints, but more recently, this has not been the case. They have been set so high so that they do not bind. The surplus target applies to general government net lending, but in addition, there are balanced budget requirements on local governments, regions and municipalities, which have the authority to impose local income taxes, labor income taxes, to cover their expenditure. That's mainly healthcare for regions, it's old age care and schools for municipalities. There are no sanctions against violations of the local government balanced budget requirements, but still they have been observed in contrast to many other European countries. Why this is so is somewhat of a riddle. Perhaps it's because of our Lutheran traditions. Anyway, that's the way it has worked. The incomes and expenditures of the old age pension system are also encompassed by the surplus target. The pension system is autonomous in the sense that it's built on defined contributions. If pension liabilities exceed assets and future contributions in the systems, then pensions are automatically adjusted. So we can't, if we follow the rules which we have so far, deficits in the pension system can't arise. Then in 2007, the fiscal framework was complemented by the establishment of the Fiscal Policy Council, which works as a fiscal watchdog. And from 2019, the so-called debt anchor was introduced, which we can regard as a long-term target for consolidated general government debt. This target is set at 35% of GDP. One could ask, of course, why the target applies to debt and not to net financial wealth. And I guess one reason is that the EU rules, which I shall return to, apply to this specific debt concept. More fundamental reason, I guess, is a worry that in a financial crisis, it may be difficult to sell government financial assets. So it may be more prudent for this reason to focus on government debt rather than on net financial wealth. As I said, we like to think that our fiscal rules have contributed to good fiscal performance. There have been made many studies of the effects of fiscal rules internationally using panel data for many countries. And in those studies, there is a clear correlation between strong fiscal rules and better fiscal outcomes. But of course, the crucial question concerns causality. Do the rules cause better fiscal outcomes, or do countries with preferences for fiscal responsibility also choose stringent rules. I believe the jury is still out on that question. There was a large meta-study a few years ago that found that the support for a causal link from rules to fiscal performance was much weakened the better the methods were to handle endogeneity. On the other hand, more recent studies have come up with more support for a causal relationship. There are only a few studies of the impact of independent fiscal institutions, such as fiscal councils, on fiscal outcomes. In them, there are some support that fiscal councils promote better outcomes, but I would say that the methods in those studies to handle endogeneity seem much less sophisticated than in the studies of fiscal rules. And Sweden is a member of the European Union, so we are bound by the EU fiscal rules in the so-called Stability Pact. The rules include a deficit ceiling, 3% of GDP. There's a government debt ceiling for Maastricht debt of 60% of GDP. Those are in the so-called corrective arm of the Stability Pact. Earlier, there was also a medium-term fiscal objective. That's an objective for structural net lending, which in the Swedish case amounted to minus 1% of GDP. That's a so-called preventive arm of the Stability Pact. But these fiscal constraints at the EU level have not really been binding for Sweden because our national constraints are much more ambitious. So I would say that the EU rules have mainly had an indirect effect. It's been seen in Sweden as important to keep a precautionary distance from those constraints so that we don't end up in a situation where we could be pressured to make painful adjustments. But then one could, of course, question in general how important the EU rules are. As you are well aware, I guess, that they have not prevented most EU countries from accumulating government debt far above the 60% ceiling. And there have been numerous violations of the rules by countries that have adopted the euro without that leading to any economic sanctions, including fines, which should have happened if the rules had been followed. Sanctions like this can't apply to EU countries outside the monetary union, such as Sweden. But still, Sweden, together with Estonia, are the only EU member states that have never been subject to the so-called excessive deficit procedure, which is violated in the EU when a member state violates the fiscal rules. Recently, as you know, there have been reforms of the Stability Pact. The deficit and debt ceilings, they remain, but the medium-term fiscal objective, that has disappeared. Instead, now the focus is on the path of structural net primary expenditure, that is, cyclically adjusted primary expenditures, increases in cyclically adjusted primary expenditure, but net of discretionary tax changes. So it's not really an expenditure rule. The path of these net primary expenditures, they are now to be determined in so-called fiscal structure plans for each country that are designed then to reduce debt ratios for countries with more than 60% of GDP in debt, or keep it below that limit for member states that are already there. But for Sweden, I would say that these new rules, they mainly add new reporting requirements to the EU, but they won't make much difference for Sweden. So let me then move on to the recent discussion we have had on our national framework. We've had a very vivid debate on whether the net lending target should be lowered. The main argument being that we see a period of temporarily very high government expenditure before us. There are huge requirements on government investment in energy infrastructure, perhaps nuclear plants, to help the green transition, in transport infrastructure, both railways and roads, which have deteriorated over time, in water and sewage systems, which have not been maintained, and of course in defense. And on top of that, Sweden is providing very substantial financial and military assistance to Ukraine. It is true that government investment has held up quite well in Sweden compared to other EU countries. Investments slightly below 5% of GDP, as you can see here. The yellow curve here represents Sweden, but still there appear to be huge future investment needs, partly because we made very large investments in infrastructure in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, which are now approaching the end of their life cycle. Personally, I have been quite active in the debate on the net lending target. I have argued in favor of moving from the current surplus target of 0.33% of GDP to a deficit target of 0.5% of GDP to make room for this desirable investment boom. According to my calculations, if we move to a deficit target of 0.5% of GDP, that would mean that we will end up with lower government net financial wealth than with the current target. We would end up somewhere at around 10% in the long run instead of 33%. These are calculations where I assumed a nominal GDP growth rate of slightly below 4%, and I assumed an appreciation of government financial assets by 1.6% per year. That's mainly stock owned by the government. Maastricht debt would converge to a little bit more than 50% of GDP in the long run instead of 28%, according to my computations, if we maintain the current surplus target. These are, of course, uncertain calculations. One reason is that you have to make assumptions on how government gross financial assets developed, which is in fact quite complicated. So I simply assume that the government's financial assets remain a constant share of GDP. Then there's a further complication, and that's that not all government debt is included in the Maastricht definition. So calculations of what net lending means in the long run are much more uncertain for debt than they are for net financial wealth. But it's for debt that we have the rules. So one has to make the computations for them, and that's what's also important in the EU context. Now, when you evaluate or try to evaluate how much we should borrow and evaluate the various targets for government net lending, there are two main considerations, I think. The first has to do with the risk that we are hit by a major economic shock again, as we were in the 1990s. Then we must have large enough safety margins to allow a large additional increase in government debt. The second aspect concerns intergenerational distribution under normal conditions. that is in a situation when we are not exposed to any deep crisis. But let me begin with the first aspect. I tried there also to make some rough calculations, assuming that in a major economic crisis, our government debt might increase by 50% of GDP. That's a bit more than what happened in our 1990s crisis. Then government debt increased by about 35 percentage points. But 50% is still less than what happened in Ireland during the Euro crisis. Then the debt ratio there increased by 75 percentage points. But you can make calculations here. You can try to examine whether we might end up in a crisis in a situation that would require politically unsustainable primary fiscal surpluses in order to stabilize the debt ratio. Under the assumption, of course, then that interest rates will rise the more government debt increases. So I made a very conservative assumption that the maximum primary surplus that could be sustained was as low as 2% of GDP. We have been above that, but only for short periods. Still, my conclusion was that with a deficit target of 0.5% of GDP, it's very unlikely that we would exceed this the debt limit where government debt starts to spiral out of control because of snowball effects. Then one can also make calculations on how large a financial burden of a permanent deficit of 0.5% of GDP instead of the current surplus target of 0.33%. What would that imply for future generations if things continue to be normal in the case that we don't meet any deep crisis? So here in the top line, I have assumed that the interest rate will be 1 percentage point higher than the GDP growth rate. And then if net lending is reduced by 0.83%, I mean, that's going from the 0.5% today, from the 0.33% today surplus to a deficit of 0.5%. What would that imply for future generations? Today, of course, if you reduce the net lending target in this way, this creates room for a smaller primary surplus or smaller primary balance of exactly 0.83% of GDP. But over time, this will mean that the net financial position of the government deteriorates. So net capital income will fall. And that's what I have in the fourth column. It will indeed fall by so much that in the long run, primary net lending must increase if you are to continue to respect the new target for overall net lending. So there will be an increased financial burden on future generations, but it will be rather small, about 0.2% of GDP. And if the deficits are used, as we hope, to raise public investment, then this financial burden will most likely in welfare terms be outweighed by the welfare increases of a higher capital stock. On the last line, I've assumed instead that the interest rate will be 1 percentage point lower than the GDP growth rate. And then, as is well known, there won't be any financial burden on future generations. the incomes will not fully offset the effect on the primary fiscal balance in the long run of creating more room by lowering the target for overall net lending. One can't rule out this possibility, even though I don't think one should bet. But of course, it's more likely to occur to the extent that the resources freed through less ambitious fiscal target are used for growth enhancing investment. Now the future fiscal target has just been reviewed by a parliamentary committee, which proposed that the target should be, the current surplus target should be replaced, not by a deficit target as I hoped, but a balanced target. With my rough calculations, that would imply a somewhat slightly lower net financial wealth than today. Today it is in fact around 28%. We would come down to perhaps 24%. We would get a little bit higher Maastricht debt than the debt anchor of 35%. I see quite some problems with the recommendation of this parliamentary commission. I don't think it will create sufficient room for the investments that are desirable. So what I fear really is that the result will be that the government starts fiddling with the target by keeping it in formally, but resorting to extra budgetary measures that is placing some investments outside the ordinary budget and allowing debt financing for those investments placed outside. In a way, this has already started since the military aid that we give to Ukraine, which is around 0.4% of GDP annually. That's excluded by the government when it evaluates whether the fiscal target is met. And I see quite some risk with going down this path, placing some items outside the ordinary budget, especially when it's in investment. I think it will mean that some investments will be treated more favorably than other investments, not be subjected to the same cost-benefit analysis of social efficiency. And another risk, of course, is that once one starts with extra budgetary items, there is no natural limit to how far one can go. Already now we see proposals from the political opposition of creating a special debt-financed defense fund of around 4% of GDP to fund the rearmament. Even though the increase in defense spending that we foresee is not likely to be temporary, it's in all likelihood sort of a question of permanent increases. We may have to go up to 3.5 or 4 or perhaps even more percent of GDP when rearming because of the crisis in Ukraine, of course, and what will happen later on, and the fact that it doesn't seem that we can trust the US anymore. So there is really a consensus that we need to spend more on defense. I can see one argument for borrowing temporarily, and that is to gradually phase in long-run reductions in other government expenditures or tax increases. There is an argument for such slow phasing in, of course, because in Sweden as elsewhere, households have had a very difficult period. We had the high inflation in 2022-23, eroding real wages, so that one might need some time to to adjust before we move to transfer cuts and tax hikes. This could also be desirable in order to maintain broad support for the higher defense spending. But the way I see some of the proposals, and the government also seems to be thinking about this, I do see some risks there for the long run sustainability of public finances if we start by increasing borrowing a lot. Okay, then I should turn to the role of fiscal policy as a tool to stabilize the business cycle. This is a picture that I showed in the beginning, that the overall fiscal balance has clearly moved in a countercyclical way. But this is mainly because of the automatic stabilizers, that tax revenues fall automatically in downturns at the same time as some expenditure, mainly on unemployment, rises. Now, this is a standard measure of the strength of automatic stabilizers. That's the so-called budget semi-elasticity, the increase in government net lending in percent of GDP when there's an increase in the GDP gap by 1 percentage point. There are many studies of the magnitude of this semi-elasticity. It is fairly large for Sweden in most of these studies, around 0.5. You can see Sweden there, it's SE rather far to the right. Now, if tax revenue is proportional to GDP and government expenditure is independent of GDP, then the budget semi-elasticity will equal the share of government expenditure in GDP. Of course, these assumptions do not exactly hold true, but they are a rough approximation. So with a share of government expenditure in GDP of around 50%, yes, then we should indeed expect a semi-elasticity of around 0.5. Now, the most recent study finds a semi-elasticity of a little bit below 0.5, 0.46. But an interesting thing is that the elasticity has fallen over time because of for two reasons. The first reason is that the tax share of GDP has fallen over time. And the second, that unemployment compensation has become less generous over time. And I think this highlights a conflict of goals, that on one hand, we want strong automatic fiscal stabilizers, but on the other hand, one might want to strengthen the incentives for work, as we have wanted to do in Sweden, which explains why we have introduced earned income tax credits. We have reduced the generosity of unemployment benefits to strengthen the incentives for employment. But that has, of course, weakened the automatic stabilizers. I mean, their strength is really the byproduct of other considerations. Also, we probably overestimate them. The reason for that is a balanced budget requirement on local governments that I discussed earlier, which means that municipalities and regions may be forced to cut their expenditures in a downturn when their tax base is, which is mainly labor incomes, fall. And this is something that is usually not factored in the computations of the strength of automatic stabilizers. Many economists in Sweden want to see a rules-based system where central government grants to local governments, which is an additional source of financing for them, would be automatically adjusted so that they increase in bad times and decrease in good times. there's a very similar discussion on this in for example, the US. Another proposal to strengthen the automatic stabilizers could be to make unemployment insurance cyclically dependent, increasing the generosity in recessions and decreasing it in booms. Okay, so far the automatic stabilizers. What about discretionary fiscal policy? As you know, there's a very large international literature on fiscal multipliers, especially in recent years, that seem to indicate that they are larger than we thought previously. Sweden is a very open economy. Exports and imports each make up around 50% of GDP, but still studies indicate that fiscal multipliers in Sweden are higher than in most other countries. And this applies especially to government investment and to government consumption, where the multipliers have been estimated to be well above unity, which suggests that discretionary fiscal policy has a role to play in stabilization of demand. This picture illustrates how discretionary fiscal policy has been pursued. So here it's the difference between structural government lending and the fiscal target on the vertical axis, and again the GDP gap on the horizontal axis. There still is a positive correlation indicating countercyclical fiscal policy, but it's a much weaker correlation than the picture I showed earlier for overall fiscal policy, which included the automatic stabilizers. And there are some notable exceptions. You see the observation furthest to the left. That is 2009, during the global financial crisis. Then we in fact had contractionary fiscal policy, higher structural net lending than the fiscal target, despite the fact that this was the year with the largest negative GDP gap since the start of the millennium. The guiding principle for fiscal policy in Sweden, or rather for stabilization policy in Sweden, has been that it's monetary policy that has the primary responsibility for stabilizing both inflation and output. But still, there has been a lack of clarity on the respective roles of the two types of policy, which was a problem, especially during the years preceding the pandemic, when the central bank, the Riksbank, opted for a negative interest rate, and also, as in many other countries, embarked on a policy of QE in order to raise inflation to the 2% target that we have. Then these policies were stepped up during the pandemic. And I think you can say that there has emerged a consensus that this was quite problematic. The QE measures caused large losses for the Riksbank when interest rates were raised again, which had to be covered by a new injection of capital from the government. The effects of QE were hard to judge. The purchases of government bonds by the central bank meant that long-term borrowing by the government was in effect replaced by short-term borrowing by the bank, thus shortening the maturity of the debt of the consolidated government sector, including the Riksbank. This is should really be a political decision, but it was in effect transferred to unelected civil servants in the central bank, which we think was a problem. Now the Riksbank Act has been revised to rein in the use of QE measures somewhat, restricting it to extreme situations. But at the same time, there has emerged a consensus that discretionary fiscal policy should play a larger role to avoid such measures. But still, we haven't really formulated any clear principles for that. Personally, I would favor a clear principle that in normal times, with minor cyclical swings, one should leave stabilization to monetary policy and the automatic stabilizers. The objective of discretionary fiscal stabilization policy should, in my view, be to support monetary policy, so that it doesn't have to become extreme. More specifically, I would like fiscal policy to step in so that we can avoid QE measures and negative interest rates in recessions and excessively high interest rates in booms. Of course, in the case of supply shocks, as in recent years, fiscal policy should not contradict monetary policy. It should not stimulate demand in general if the central bank tries to restrict it. But also in such situations, fiscal policy should play an insurance role by supporting low-income households and financing measures that reduce the risk that short-term unemployment becomes long-term. I think one also should discuss more use of semi-automatic stabilizers, measures prepared in advance to use in a recession, but which should require a discretionary decision to implement. Labour market programs have traditionally played such a role in Sweden. Short-term work programs could do that as well. Perhaps also programs of general tax rebates or transfer programs to low-income households. But these are still open questions in Sweden. Then, to my final point, the Fiscal Policy Council, which I know some of you are interested in. There's been a strong international trend to establish independent fiscal institutions, IFIs, tasked with monitoring fiscal policy and its long-term sustainability. When the principal is the government, they are usually labeled fiscal councils, but parliamentary budget offices in many countries play a similar role. We have such institutions today in about 50 countries, as shown in this diagram. And you can see that after 2007, 2008, the number has grown much more rapidly than before. The idea of fiscal councils or IFIs, independent fiscal institutions, is that it's to increase the reputation costs for government of violating their own fiscal rules, and to increase the transparency of fiscal policy in general, to add more professional expertise to the economic policy discussion. Some countries have a long tradition of such bodies. We have the Netherlands, its Central Planning Bureau. Denmark has its Economic Council. They were established in the 1940s, 1960s. We have the Congressional Budget Office in the US, established in the 1970s, which also played such a role. The Swedish Fiscal Policy Council was set up in 2007. I was appointed the first chair. The main remit is to monitor long-run fiscal sustainability and the government's adherence to the fiscal rules, but also to look at stabilization aspects of fiscal policy. Then the remit is a bit wider. It's also to evaluate employment and growth policy, to stimulate a general discussion of economic policy, but with a clear backward-looking focus. So it's ex-post evaluations. The council was established by a liberal conservative government. The political opposition, Social Democrats, the Greens, the left, they opposed the creation of the council. They believed that it would in all instances back a liberal conservative agenda. But I would say that we were very lucky. We managed to get into conflict with the liberal conservative government already in 2009, when we argued that fiscal policy was too contractionary in a situation with rapidly increasing unemployment due to the global financial crisis. And I think this helped establish the Council's credibility. So now its existence is, in fact, supported by all the political parties. Formally, the Council is an authority under the government. Now, of course, the crucial thing for credibility is that's to build a reputation for independence and impartiality. But still, I would prefer the parliament to be the principal. I think it would be a stronger guarantee for independence and that the government does not put undue pressure on the council. This has happened in the past when the council has been threatened by the government with budget cuts when the government didn't like the council's analysis. And I believe one way to reduce the risk for budget pressures could be to give the council a multi-annual budget. This is what the OECD recommends for independent fiscal institutions to safeguard their independence. The council works in a different way than in the original proposal. The proposal came initially from a government commission in 2002, which was set up to analyze fiscal policy in the event of Swedish participation in the EU's monetary union. Then it was realized that if we no longer had our own monetary policy, fiscal policy would have to do more if we were hit by country-specific shocks. So it was to strengthen the incentives for an appropriate fiscal policy that the government commission proposed this establishment of a fiscal council. And the idea then was that the council should give recommendations in advance, ex ante recommendations on the fiscal policy stance. But this was not the way the remit was formulated when the council was established. Now it's clear that there is no clear distinction between ex post and ex ante analysis. So some of the council's analysis have been rather forward-looking. But still, I believe that a clear remit to make recommendations on future policy, that would be a very desirable step. And I think such recommendations, they should in particular focus on the interplay between fiscal and monetary policy, which we now have no really good agenda, no good arena to discuss. I believe politicians are afraid to discuss monetary policy because they don't want to infringe on the independence of the central bank, and the central bank shuns away from being too outspoken about fiscal policy. And this implies, I think, risks that we end up, as we have sometimes had, in a suboptimal policy mix. Now, there is one argument against the Fiscal Policy Council giving policy recommendations, and that is that it should be inappropriate both to propose policy ex ante and then evaluate policy ex post. So for this reason, a working party within the Ministry of Finance proposed that the Fiscal Policy Council should be complemented with an independent stabilisation policy council that would give the ex ante advice. This is a proposal that did not fly. One reason, I think, is that we're a small country like you. We can't really staff too many independent policy institutions. And I also think that the weight of each institution is diluted if we have too many of them. So I think we should just stick with the Fiscal Policy Council and expand its mandates. There are also nowadays EU rules that oblige us to have an independent fiscal institution like the Fiscal Council. And they have also in EU legislation been given an enhanced role that they are tasked with making evaluating or approving the government's macroeconomic forecasts, which according to EU stipulations should be done on a comply or explain basis. That is, the government should either adapt to the Fiscal Council's judgment, or if it does not, it must explain why. But this, I think, this enhanced role puts pressure on the resources of the Fiscal Policy Council. Today we have a very small body, secretariat of only five persons, in addition to 6 members, mostly academics, working very much part-time. So I think there's a need. One shouldn't have a Fiscal Council with as small resources as the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council has. It also has the task of costing various government proposals, which is a task that is completely impossible to perform at present. So this expanded role, according to EU regulations, I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's too small a step. I would also, as I said, want to have the Fiscal Policy Council giving clear policy recommendations. Well, with this, I have come to the end of the speech. It's up to you to conclude if there are good reasons to learn from Sweden. Clearly, our fiscal framework has worked well in many respects, but I also believe there is much to improve. I don't think we should in Sweden be too satisfied with the fiscal framework as it stands. I think we have to realize that we should continue adapting it to new circumstances. Of course, the immediate challenge is how to deal with the need for a very large increase in defense expenditure. Unfortunately for us, we have an aggressive Russia very close. You are more fortunate in this respect, but you have to worry about China instead, I guess. And we both have to face the reality of the United States that have become completely unreliable, I should think I must say, perhaps even aggressive in its foreign policy stance. So I'll end there with this rather pessimistic note. Thank you.
Thank you, Lars, for your fascinating presentation. I was struck when listening to this just about how different the fiscal policy outcomes are in Sweden compared with countries across Europe, and just how the policy-making community, I guess, and the political economy have interacted to lead to good fiscal policy outcomes, both on the sustainability side as well as on the stabilisation side, where I think the outcomes are quite striking compared with other European countries. Colleagues online, we have about 30 minutes for questions for the professor. I'd encourage you to put those questions in the Q&A chat and keep them coming in as we roll through the discussion, and we'll try and cover as many of those questions as we can. I'll maybe take the opportunity of hosting to ask the first question, Professor. And my question really is, can you help us to understand a little bit about the political economy of fiscal policy in the Swedish context? And you make this fascinating observation, which we've always tried to unpick, which is, do we see countries adopt these institutions because the political economy would have made good fiscal policy decisions anyway, or are these institutions and decision rules really a large contributor? And I was interested in your observations about how you see that in the Swedish context. I wondered if you could help us understand a little bit more.
Yes. I think clearly what happened in the 1990s explain how we have behaved with respect to fiscal policy. That was a real shock. It may not sound today that 75% of GDP in that is very high, but it was high at the time, and it was really troublesome. Sort of interest rates on our government debt really skyrocketed and forced us to adjust. So I think what happened then convinced policymakers that we must build a new system so that this does not happen again. But I think I would interpret it the way that what happened in the 1990s explains both the institutional setup that we chose and policies. So I probably also without the institutions, for a long time at least, that would still have influenced policy making. So you can joke about sort of a good crisis, that's a prerequisite for doing good things. And I think that really happened in Sweden. It happened in Denmark as well. So Sweden and Denmark have quite similar developments when it comes to fiscal policy and debt developments. So a big crisis now and then, that's rather good for building good institutions and promoting good policy. But of course, it's even better to avoid that by creating good policies and good institutions in advance. But that's not always so easy.
You know, that's a good observation, Professor. We the way that you've posed it is that you know, there's a living memory of wanting to avoid these large shocks that are quite challenging for the economy and the political situation. And I guess the policy institutions help to extend like the half-life of the memory, you know. As we get a new set of officials and we get a new set of politicians, these institutions are there to sort of remind them that, you know, that we want to avoid these large adjustments in the future. One of the other observations you made was that Sweden has actually been able to achieve sustainable fiscal policy outcomes while maintaining actually a reasonably high share of public investment, notwithstanding that there are still large investment needs. You know, one of the observations is that across Europe, you know, countries have actually, even with countries with relatively low debt, have reduced public investment since the global financial crisis. And I was wondering, what are the institutions that are in place within Sweden, and what does the role of the fiscal policy framework play in sort of sustaining those levels of public investment?
Well, of course, it's created room for public investment that we have had been able to hold government debt low. So it's not been crowded out by large interest payments. I think that is important. At the same time, I think politicians today are overemphasizing this. They don't see sort of that we are probably in a different situation now, that we need to speed up investment, and we probably could do that by sort of lowering the target. I mean, the whole idea of reducing government debt and increasing net financial wealth was to create a room for maneuver in case sort of larger expenditure needs arose. And I think that is what is happening now. But I see a large inconsistency among Swedish politicians, that they were very much against sort of financing a temporary investment boom by reducing the fiscal target. But now, when we are thinking about permanent increases that are very large for defense, then they suddenly forget everything they said half a year ago and want to mainly finance these permanent expenditure increases by borrowing. So it's not logically consistent to me, which is something that I'm trying to say in the public debate. But right now it's very unclear what will happen. This agreement among political parties that we should only move from a surplus target to a balance target, that was taken half a year ago. But now, when we realize that we may have to increase defense spending permanently by perhaps 2% of GDP, then that's creating a completely new situation where politicians don't really seem to know how they should tackle this.
Lars, I wondered if we could turn your attention to the Fiscal Policy Council, drawing on your experience. So we have a question here about how much practical difference to policy making has come from the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council, or is it more of a sort of a luxury when you have a really well-functioning and well-governed country like Sweden? I wondered if you could talk us through that.
Yes. Yes, I think first important sort of things that happened with the Fiscal Policy Council, that was during the global financial crisis. I think we realized earlier than the government in the council that something much more dramatic was happening than an ordinary cyclical downturn. So we advocated then quite expansionary fiscal policy, which the government did not want at the time. I mean, they were thinking about the crisis in the 1990s and how debt exploded. I think that our arguments influenced the government with some lag. So policies were changed gradually, but too late. I think, in fact, the main impact came about 10 years later. So when the pandemic came, then sort of it was not hard to convince the government then to adopt very expansionary policy, which I think were right in Sweden. They were not excessive as in some other European countries. So we had an increase in government debt from 35 to perhaps 40%. But then it came down again. And I think yes, I think the Fiscal Policy Council played a role there in sort of changing the way that politicians were thinking about fiscal policy in downturns. Then there have been sort of a more sort of continuous role as a watchdog, with a council or the watchdog barking when the government has shown tendencies to be a bit too expansionary in general. Yeah, I guess that is what I could say. Of course, it's always very difficult to pinpoint exactly what difference has it made, but I think the very important role of the council has been to sort of raise the quality in the general policy discussion. I think that has been important. But we have not been in a situation where sort of the government has been sort of extreme in pursuing an expansionary policy, which the council has had to warn about. That hasn't happened.
Lars, we've had a couple of questions about how the arrangements in Sweden deal with the potential for political pressure, the appointments process, and you talked already about the funding, which from your perspective is a little bit less than ideal, and the relationship with Parliament. In the Swedish context, what are the critical safeguards and points of success that sort of underpin the independence of the council?
I think it's the credibility that we built from the start, that we had to fight this view among opposition parties that we were sort of economists with a liberal conservative outlook. So that's why they opposed the council from the beginning. And as I said, I think we were extremely lucky that we very soon came into a situation where sort of reasonable economists would advocate sort of an expansionary policy because we had a very deep recession. And that really helped swing the attitudes of the opposition parties. So they entered an agreement, in fact, with the government. We were very much criticized by the government. That sort of was a public spat between me and the Minister for Finance, where he overreacted, which provoked sort of a reaction against the minister. And his way out of this, when he was also criticized by the OECD for interfering with the council's independence, was to enter into an agreement with the opposition parties, which sort of gave the council more of a backing. But I do think that it would be a good thing to be under Parliament instead of under the government. It would be sort of an extra layer of security for the council. But of course, the main defense is always it's always a reputation that you build. I think that's the main thing. That and the EU rules nowadays, which did not exist when the council was started. But today, every EU member state is obliged to have an independent fiscal institution.
Lars, I wonder if we could turn a little bit to the issue of discretionary fiscal policy and interaction with monetary policy. You've talked, I think, about having some principles that would apply to how the fiscal authorities think about deploying fiscal policy and consistent with the independent monetary regime. And you've talked about, I guess, trying to get fiscal policy and monetary policy to be more aligned so that we don't need to have the sort of extremes of monetary policy response, either at the top of the cycle or the bottom of the cycle. I wondered if you could talk about a little bit more about how do you think that would work in practice, and what has been the response of the authorities, of the fiscal authorities and the monetary policy authorities to some of the ideas that you've been writing about with colleagues about more active use of fiscal policy in Sweden?
Yes, I do believe there has emerged some kind of consensus that fiscal policy should play an important role when we have sort of large cyclical swings. No, we can rely on monetary policy and automatic stabilizers. Perhaps they should be somewhat strengthened. But if cyclical swings are not too large. But I think there is a fairly strong view among both politicians and economists that the amount of QE that was applied by the Riksbank before the pandemic and during the pandemic was too large, and we should try to avoid that type of situation in the future. And one way of doing this is, of course, to let fiscal policy play a more important role in such situations. I mean, in the international debate, there have been these proposals that when the central bank sort of comes close to the effective lower bound for interest rates, it could sort of express a view on sort of which fiscal policy measures or the amount of fiscal policy measures that would be needed to replace the interest rate cuts that can't be made because you can't go or don't want to go below a lower bound. That's one possibility, that the central bank could be more explicit about that, or perhaps even have a remit to do that, to announce very clearly when it feels that fiscal policies should step in. The Fiscal Policy Council could also play such a role, of course. I mean, if making recommendations. That was what I was hinting about, that if it got an expanded mandate, not to evaluate monetary policy, but sort of evaluate the relationship between monetary and fiscal policy. The Fiscal Policy Council could also be tasked with sort of signaling to the government when it thinks there's a mismatch between monetary and fiscal policy should step in more. That should, of course, be in both directions. I mean, both in the expansionary and in the contractionary direction.
Do you think that view depends a little bit upon how you judge the costs and benefits of QE? And in the New Zealand context, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand sought, during its first experience with QE, it sought from the government an indemnity for the potential fiscal or for the potential losses on their balance sheet, which in the New Zealand environment are consolidated onto the government's balance sheet. Is that the assignment in Sweden as well, that the fiscal and the monetary authorities need to agree on how to manage the losses ex ante, or and do you think that the central bank authorities in Sweden, what's their view about the efficacy of quantitative easing?
The central bank law here, there's no ex ante sort of discussion about how losses should be covered. But there is in the Riksbank Act, the Central Bank Law, Central Bank Act, there is a provision that if the equity of the Riksbank falls below a certain level, the Riksbank must turn to Parliament to get a capital injection. So that was what happened. But the provision is not about whether it has to be covered. It's that the central bank has to sort of ask the the parliament. The central bank is an authority not under the government in Sweden, it's under parliament. So it has to turn to parliament, and then it got a capital injection, but a smaller one than they asked for. So that's how things work here, but that was, as far as I know, and I don't think it should be any consultation in advance. The way I had hoped it would work, or hope it would work in the future, is that we would not end up in this situation that we did after 2022-23, if there was sort of a clear responsibility in such a situation for fiscal policy to be more active. And that, I think, there is an emerging consensus also among politicians that should happen. This parliamentary commission that I talked about, that revised or had the task of revising the surplus target, is very vague on principles of the use of fiscal policy for stabilisation purposes. But they are on one point, they are clear that in situations where we meet the effective lower bound, then fiscal policy should play a larger role. And also that it's in such a situation, the multipliers are probably much larger than under normal circumstances.
One last question I think we have time for, Lars. This one's a little bit put on your gaze into your crystal ball, I think, and thinking about the new environment that you're facing, or that many of the countries are facing, which is, I think, a large-scale demands for additional military spending and a sort of international economic environment with higher geopolitical risks and concerns about trading, approaches to trade across countries. So how do you see this playing, the adjustment needed in the fiscal policy position in Sweden? How do you see this debate playing out over the next 5 to 10 years?
I had some problems now with the sound, so I heard about 75% of your question, but I'll try to guess. Of course, I mean, there's extreme uncertainty now. There's uncertainty about tariffs in the US. I mean, it's tariffs in the morning are raised, and then they are lowered again before they are introduced. So I mean, it's a complete chaos, which I think is very bad for the economy overall. Hard to say how we should adjust to that. Yes, it makes, in general, diversification of trade much more important. Then there is this question of, which now is sort of paramount in Europe, about how are we realize we have to fund our defense ourselves now, and that's, I mean, a tremendous change. Today, I mean, the Germans or the German parliament took a first step to abolish the debt brake there and allow spending on defense to be sort of outside the debt brake. Germany can do that, I guess, because they do have higher debt than we, but they have lower debt than most European countries. So I think that will change thinking on fiscal policy. I mean, in the EU, the deficit ceiling sort of will be adjusted so that defense spending will not, if member states exceed the deficit ceiling because of increased defense expenditure, that will not be counted. That will be an exemption for this. At the same time, they start many countries with so high debts, so it is problematic to increase debts even more. It is dangerous, but it's like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. There's also, after these years of high inflation and large real income losses, there's a lot of opposition from right-wing parties and a lot of discontent to exploit. So it's not easy for many countries to raise taxes and lower transfer payments, lower public consumption to finance higher defense expenditure. So it's really a problem that for political reasons they probably must finance it by more debt. But it's also awkward when you start with very high debt rates, often above 100%. So I'm happy that I'm a Swede. I'm not a Frenchman. I mean, France has a government debt of 115% or something like that. And a lot of opposition against raising taxes or cutting government expenditure. So now it will be very, very tough for politicians to handle and for economists to give good advice. So I think in Sweden it's sort of at least in a good position. But even here, I'm a bit worried that politicians do not dare to say to the public that we need to increase expenditure on defense for our security. But it will cost, and it will have a cost.
Thank you very much, Professor. Unfortunately, we've run out of time on today's seminar, and we need to let you get to bed. So, Lars, thank you very much for taking the time to share your insights with us at the end of the world. Thank you, everyone, for joining us online for this guest lecture series. Just a small plug for the next seminar on April 9th. We'll have Ilan Noy from the University of Victoria, who will talk to us about costs and consequences of sudden onset disaster shocks. This is what we talk about down in the Shaky Isles, Lars. So we'll put that on the website shortly. Let me close our seminar today with karakia. So, pike te kaha, pike te ora, pike te wairua, huiei, taikie. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you again, Lars, for your time. Atea wā.
Thank you.